someone who's a descendant of the transatlantic slave trade, I want to talk about the East African slave trade. I feel like we learn about the transatlantic slave trade as like the pinnacle of slavery, the pinnacle of racism, the pinnacle of atrocities committed by Europeans. And when you learn about the East African slave trade, you're like, holy shit. Because first of all, the East African slave trade was started by the Arabs, and they were here eons before the Europeans got over to West Africa. You just realize that they had Africa surrounded on all sides, like West Africa, North Africa. The Arabs are the reason that North Africa is Muslim and Arabs. Literally, that's the reason. Then you've got East Africa, and then you got Southern Africa, which was like up into modern times talking apartheid. It makes me wonder, like, when does Africa get to catch a break? And it makes me think about the construct of modernization and globalization within a continent who has never been allowed to develop and exist on its own. I call this forced modernization, and I'm gonna coin that one of these days, but really, the continent of Africa was not allowed to modernize on its own. It was forced to modernize by powers that showed up and wanted their resources. So say like in West Africa, people built roads so that they could get the things they wanted. And then in other parts where they didn't want shit, they just left it. Like, that's just it. Anybody who was this descendant of the transatlantic slave trade, like learning about over here, what was happening over here, crazy. And how far it went into what is modern times. Like, they have photos of people on slave ships here, photos with cameras, because cameras were invented by the time they were doing it. Insanity.
The Arab-Muslim slave trade, also known as the Trans-Saharan trade or Eastern slave trade, lasted longer than the transatlantic slave trade. It operated for more than 1,300 years, taking millions of Africans away from the continent to work in foreign lands under the most inhumane conditions. Unfortunately, because it has not been as closely studied as the transatlantic slave trade, the exact number of people captured from Africa in the trans-Saharan slave trade is yet to be fully ascertained. It is currently estimated at about 9 million. 9 million souls.
When Muslims go and conquer the adjacent country, what do? We kill them all? No. The Prophet says, the first thing you do is call them to Islam. If they accept it, leave them. Khalas, they're Muslims, we go. If they refuse, then tell them to pay taxation, jizya. If they refuse, then we have to fight. And if we fight you, then we capture you, you become our slaves, and we take your land, and you take because you refuse, I give you two good options.
Oh. Two good options. You give me two good options. Either convert to Islam, pay ridiculous amounts of money, or we kill you. Yeah, two good options, perfectly fine, perfectly acceptable.
We'll take a look at the enslavement that was responsible for over 20 million Africans across the Sahara to Egypt, Syria, and other parts of the Middle East. The Trans-Sahara Slave Trade. There were two major forms of slave trades in Africa. The first was the Trans-Sahara Slave Trade. The second is the Transatlantic or the Triangular Slave Trade. The Trans-Sahara Slave Trade is by far the oldest type of slave trade documented in Africa and perhaps the world at large. It dates as far back as 1000 BCE. Trade routes were already established. A large number of items from foodstuff, gold and salt, which originated from the rich salt mines of North Africa, were carried along these routes, and every trade had its own don: the Arabs. The Arab merchants conducted their business between North African states in the West. In return, they brought in weapons, fabrics, and other precious items to sell to the North Africans, even down towards the West. West Africans, how far? The lucrative business meant prosperity for everyone, which led to the need for cheaper manpower that will later be found in slaves. Ooh. Slave trade, and this was later to be monopolized for hundreds of years, even up to the 19th century. The spread of Islam in West Africa, especially in areas close to the Sahara, bridged the communication gap between traders of African and Arab origin and fostered more trade across the desert. While it was estimated that the transatlantic slave trade, which occurred in the later years, led to the forced exodus of over 18 million Africans, the exact number of Africans traded across the Sahara is unknown. Contemporary historians believe that this was an estimate of over 27 million Africans. The journey across the Sahara, which is the natural demarcation between North and West Africa, was about 1,200 miles, which by any means is not an easy feat. But the introduction of desert limos, camels, reduced the distance, but not for the slaves. They endured the scorching sun, the cold nights, sandy walkways, and sandstorms which gave no warnings. The poisonous reptiles. Oh God. The slaves often go for days without food and water. Please give me water to drink. Dehydration
Unalive.
more slaves than their slave masters did. Sick and feeble ones would be left behind to die, and rebellious ones would be
Unalive.
The women either became sex slaves or concubines, and some of the men were trained as soldiers. Whatever the case, they all had a common destiny: to be sold as slaves to the highest bidder once the desert has been crossed.
We do not talk as often as we should about the slavery that took place in the eastern coast of Africa from the year 650 AD. The enslavement of African peoples by the Arab Emirates, if you may, the Omani Empire and all those empires. This started in 650 AD, as I've already said. And estimates now suggest that as many as 18 million Africans were taken from the eastern coast of Africa, from what is today Kenya, Tanzania, up to the hinterland in places such as Malawi, and were taken to the Arab world. One of the things that happened in the Arab world, why you don't see the evidence of black slaves, is that they were castrating men, and therefore they did not produce. And it is something that we don't talk about as loudly as we should, is not as documented in the manner that it should, but that is the first wave of slavery.
Slavery in the Arab World by Murray Gordon. In decades after the last ship sailed westward toward the Americas and the West Indies, where slavery had been abolished by the early 1870s, Arab dhows
wait, you see it? Arab dhows, that's what I wanted, meaning Arab ships. Arab slave ships. Read that again, Arab what?
Arab dhows were furtively moving out of Zanzibar, Mombasa, and other East African ports, following the familiar Indian Ocean routes for the consignment of ebony.
Now listen, slavery was outlawed by Britain. So the lie they called, remember you had to have cargo. What kind of cargo is on your ship? They said ebony. But it was really our bodies. Y'all know what ebony, like ebony wood? Go ahead.
The masters of these fast lateen-rigged ships were methodically packed in sardine-like fashion with men, women, and children.
Arabs did the same thing. What are you gonna
maneuvered skillfully in evading the small force of British sloops.
See, they had to evade the smaller force of British sloops. The British was going on making sure slavery had ended, okay? So they would stop the ships on the oceans, but the Arabs had these quick, smaller ships. Go ahead.
Charged with the impossible mission of interdicting this illicit traffic.
Meaning slave trade. Go ahead.
The blacks caught up in this trade were fated to be sold in the slave marts of Arabia.
Wait. It says the blacks caught up in this trade were fated to be sold in the slave marts of Arabia. So we were sold in Arabia too. Go ahead.
The Persian Gulf.
We were sold in the Persian Gulf too. Go ahead.
The Ottoman Empire.
That's Turkey. Go ahead.
And India.
And India. So we don't talk about this.
So when I talked about chattel slavery initially and focused on the transatlantic slave trade, I saw some of y'all trying to check me. And listen, if you thought I left something out, you're right to speak on it. Because if I'm going to talk about Black displacement, I can't leave out how we were trafficked across every direction, not just the Atlantic. But let's be very clear. There were no untruths in what I said. What I shared was one part of a much bigger system. So today I'm going to break down the other part, one they rarely talk about, the Arab slave trade. Most of us are taught about the transatlantic slave trade, right? Where European nations kidnapped and enslaved over 12 million Africans and shipped them to the Americas. But long before that started, another massive slave system was already in place, the Arab slave trade. This began around the 7th century, just after the rise of Islam, and it lasted for over 1,200 years. That's twice as long as the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans, estimates say anywhere from 10 to 20 million, were taken from East, Central, and parts of West Africa and sold across North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, the Arabian Peninsula, and even parts of India, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia. And here's the key thing. This wasn't one single trade route. It was a whole network made up of two major routes that we're going to break down next. So we're going to talk about the trans-Saharan slave trade, which is just the first part of the Arab system. The trans-Saharan slave trade, it involved moving enslaved people north, across the Sahara Desert, into places like Egypt, Libya, Morocco, and Tunisia. And this was done through caravans, which, if you don't know, included huge groups of camels and traders moving through brutal desert conditions. People walked for hundreds of miles in chains without enough water or food. Thousands died just trying to get to the slave market. So who were the victims? Most were young boys and girls from places like Mali, Niger, Chad, and Sudan. The boys were often castrated and made to serve in royal palaces, harems, and courts. The girls were sold as concubines, house servants, and entertainers. The violence was extreme, but so was the erasure. Most of these people never got the chance to build families. Many never made it out of servitude. And because they were often forced to assimilate, their history was wiped out. No records, no surnames, no lineage left behind. So Route 2, under the Arab system, is the Indian Ocean slave trade, which ran east, not north. This route took people from East Africa, places like Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique, and Madagascar, and shipped them across the Indian Ocean to the Arabian Peninsula, Iran and Iraq, parts of India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, even Indonesia and southern China. This trade lasted over 1,000 years. And just like the Trans-Saharan route, it focused on Black labor, sexual exploitation, and military service. In India and Pakistan, enslaved Africans became soldiers, guards, palace staff, or enslaved women for royal households. Many of their descendants are actually still there today, but they're often marginalized and forgotten. So why don't we hear about this as much as we hear about the transatlantic? One word: erasure. Many enslaved men were castrated, so they couldn't have families. Others were absorbed into Arab and Asian societies, renamed, converted, and stripped of all identity. There was no diaspora like we see in the Americas, because so many people were intentionally erased. And because Arab and Muslim societies never really publicly confronted their role in slavery, there's no global reckoning, no memorials, no documentaries, no widespread education, just silence. So yeah, I focused on the transatlantic slave trade in my last video, because that's our direct link, especially here in the Americas. But if we're talking about Black displacement and stolen lives, we do have to talk about all of it. The Arab slave trade, the Trans-Saharan route, the Indian Ocean route. 3 names, 1 system, one long history of Black people being stolen, used, erased, and never properly accounted for. So we honor them, even the ones we don't know, because we're not just survivors of one trade. We're survivors of every direction they dragged us. And the world still owes all of us answers.
White people were also slaves, and it's not something that's commonly acknowledged. White people were actually slaves in several points in history. For example, the Barbary slave trade. Now, the Barbary slave trade was when Barbary pirates from the Barbary coast, which is the coastal region of North Africa, would conduct surprise attacks on coastal towns, boats, and villages, where they would capture residents and enslave them. Most of these people were European Christians. They would capture vessels, board them, capture crew members, and a lot of them happened to be British sailors. In fact, some of them were American sailors and explorers. These pirates would even use deception, posing as friendly ships, just to get close enough to their targets before launching an attack and enslaving them, and obviously looting them for everything they got. If you want to learn more about the Barbary slave trade and also hear personal real-life accounts of people that were enslaved, make sure to get my ebook, Chains of Fate. The link is in my bio.
If you want to get into the slavery thing, you got to address the fact that 1 million white Europeans were taken from Britain and southern Europe by Barbary pirates and sold into slavery in Africa.
Is that true?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
What are you going to do about it? I mean, like, these people might have been my ancestors who were stolen. Can I get any money from...
That's a high number, actually.
It's a lot.
1 million?
Yeah.
How many slaves came from Africa to the U.S.?
I think the transatlantic slave trade is thought to be up to 11 million, maybe
Still
12.
10%
maybe
of that.
12. And a much larger number, perhaps 18 million, were taken east from Africa in the Arab slave trade, which ran much longer. And the interesting thing about that is...
The Arab slave trade had more traffic.
Yes.
From Africa.
From Africa, sold by Africans to Arabs.
Interesting.
And you know why we don't hear anything about it?
I haven't heard
Because it was actually genocidal. They castrated all of the men. Yes. So there are no descendants.
What was their objective in doing that?
To get the men, use them as labor, and make sure they didn't have children.
When we talk about the slave trade, most of the ships during the slave trade were basically Jewish.
Correct.
Most of the slave traders were Arabs, correct?
Correct.
But why is the white man always vilified for this when it was the Jewish ships and the Arabs that were actually the biggest part of the slave trade?
Well, you have to look at who is dominant in history as far as academia is concerned, literature, the publishing houses. Most of them are Jewish ran. So it's just like with the mafia. Most people think Italian when it comes to the mafia, but it's really Jewish. Jews were behind the books. Meyer Lansky was the banker of the mafia. He handled the books. The Jews will be behind the scenes and they'll put the blame on whites.
Why? Ask the bloody question. Why are they only teaching you the history of slavery as far back as the 16th and the 17th century? Why are they only going that far back? Because they don't want you to go farther back than that. Because then you'll actually find out the truth. But from the 16th and 17th century, we'll teach you about slavery. You've got to go further back. And you've got to understand and question, why do they do this throughout the whole of America, in all the public schools? Why do they only go back as far as the 16th and the 17th century to talk about slavery? We've got to go further back than that. Because Islam designed infernal slavery. And then the Ashkenazi Khazars, those who say they are Jews and are not, are the ones that marketed it. And the regal Negro nomads exiled from the kingdom of Judah were the main recipients of it at the hands of the indigenous black Africans. Because you've got to understand, the regal class of the house of Judah came down from Israel and they came into the land of the black Africans. And the black Africans resented the regal class of the house of Judah in their land because they had laws, they had customs, they had civility. And they were a regal class of Negro that came down into Africa. And later on, it was the Ashkenazi, the Islamic slave traders as well, that then worked together with the indigenous black Africans to enslave the regal house of Judah. This is what we've got to understand, but you've got to go back before the 16th century to understand the roots of it. So we're going to see, as we dig into this, where this slavery came from, because it was really a system that was very, very well crafted. There was Islamic masters, and there were white Ashkenazi Khazar ship owners. There were the buyers and the sellers. And they're not going to fill you in on all of this, but really you've got a four-tier system. Number one, you have the Negro nomads that were exiled from the kingdom of Judah. Number two, you had indigenous black African hunters that resented the regal Negro nomads that had come into their territory with their own customs, with their own laws that were different and would not assimilate into their tribal culture. They were their own tribe. They were the regal house of Judah. And number three, you had Islamic trappers that worked with the indigenous black Africans to trap the regal Negro house of Judah. And then you had them sell them to the Ashkenazi ship merchants, along with many Portuguese and British Ashkenazi. So again, we've got the four-tier system. Number one, we have the regal Negro nomadic class that are exiled from the kingdom of Judah. They are their own royal tribe in Africa. Then, number two, we have the native black African trackers. They're going to track them down. And number three, we have the Islamic trappers, because between 650 of the Common Era and 1900 of the Common Era, 10 to 20 million people were enslaved by the Arab slave traders. Over 20 million enslaved Africans were delivered through the Trans-Sahara route to the Islamic world. Can you get your head around that? That's not even touching the Americas. Over 80 million more blacks died at the hands of Islam en route. And number four, we have Ashkenazi Khazar Jewish ship merchants. And of course, the Portuguese and the British Ashkenazi were the main buyers. Islam and the Ashkenazi, those that say that they are Jews and are not, were the main sellers. Does that make sense? You've got to dig into this further. We have the two tiers right there. We have the Islamic trappers, and then we have the Ashkenazi ship merchants. You see, the Romans, they were globalist slavers. They were globalists then and now. They just migrated to Gaul, Ashkenazi, the sellers, and Britain, the British, of course, the buyers. German Jewry and British Jewry, where have they gone to? Well, they've descended upon Wall Street, upon Hollywood and Washington, D.C., as we see it right now, just to fuel this cataclysmic final war of globalism, which is none other than renaming colonialism. And this is the world that you and I live in. And I'm so sick and tired of these talking heads when it comes to the election time, trying to enslave everybody and cause racial division to try and get the votes. When ultimately, if Israel would just wake up to who's enslaving us, regardless of our skin color, he says what? I am Yahweh your Elohim that delivered you from slavery. We all need to get out from underneath this slavery system, and we need to come together as Joseph's multicolored Melchizedek cloak. But we've got to help identify who are our Jewish brothers and where are our Jewish brothers as the whole house of Israel comes together. Because Islam and the Slavic regions, I mean, where do we get these names? Yugoslavia, of course. Czechoslovakia, Slovakia. These were all regions of bestial slavery that eventually arrived on the African continent. These were areas where Islam invented infernal slavery up in those Slavic regions that then eventually arrived on the African continent, and the black regal Negroes of Judah were the recipients of it. But not only black Judah, but Europeans were even kidnapped by the Arabs and the Ashkenazi traders during the war or peace periods in the medieval times.
In Istanbul were people of many different races. Skin color did not mark a person as free or enslaved. As a result, the descendants of those enslaved within the Ottoman Empire, unlike the descendants of enslaved Africans, have not faced centuries of racism and discrimination. The trafficking of Africans into slavery began much further back in time than many people realize, with enslaved people shipped not across the Atlantic Ocean, but the Indian Ocean instead.
The Indian Ocean slave trade is probably the oldest of the slave trades and transported more human beings, and it was multi-directional.
Exports of the enslaved from the Indian Ocean to the Muslim world grew exponentially after Arab traders won control of the Swahili coast and sea routes in the 8th century. The trafficking of millions of human beings from Africa's east coast led to the emergence of African diaspora communities like the Shidis in Pakistan and India and the Afro-Iraqis in Basra.
Islamic law does not permit slave trading. Many Muslims throughout the Indian Ocean world ignored those rules. And so they plundered and captured Africans, Indians, Southeast Asians, usually non-Muslims.
Both Christianity and Islam asserted the value of a person as created by God. Yet adherents to both faiths accepted the capture, sale, and ownership of men, women, and children from Africa. The Atlantic trade to the west centered on labor and shipped at least 2 men for every woman. The Indian Ocean trade to the east centered on services and included soldiers, cooks, and concubines. It shipped roughly 2 women for every man. The hub of this trade was in modern-day Tanzania, under control of the Omani Arab Empire from the 17th century. For 200 years, it specialized in 3 things: ivory, spices, and slaves. By 1807, Britain had finally turned its back on the slave trade. Naval warships were dispatched to suppress the slave trades of other nations, leading the British Royal Navy into the Indian Ocean and into direct contact with the slave traders of Zanzibar.
In the Western Hemisphere, among the reasons for this anomaly were the higher mortality rates of slaves in transit to North Africa and the Middle East, their greater vulnerability to the diseases of that region, and a very low rate of reproduction. Because the slaves were brought from long distances, often from isolated villages, they might lack biological resistance to the diseases encountered along the overland slave trade routes or at their final destinations. Although manumission was widespread in Islamic lands, the beneficiaries of this were often military slaves and others in higher occupations, where the slaves were most apt to be white rather than black. In general, black slaves were used in more menial and laborious tasks, and it was these slaves who were most likely to live and die as slaves, with their children being born into slavery. They had few children, however, for both marriage and casual sex among slaves was suppressed. Moreover, the death rate among those few children was so high that they rarely lived to adulthood. The widespread use of eunuchs in the harems of the Islamic countries further reduced the ability of the African slave population to reproduce itself. In the 10th century, the court of the Caliph of Baghdad reportedly included 7,000 black eunuchs and 4,000 white eunuchs. With the passing centuries, as European nations grew militarily stronger and became better able to resist the Islamic nations, European slaves became scarcer in the Islamic lands to which they had once been sent in great numbers. Their importation was drastically reduced in the early decades of the 19th century, when Tsarist Russia conquered the Caucasus, from which European slaves were being shipped to the Ottoman Empire. However, as late as the 1850s, orders against the traffic in white slaves from Russian-controlled Georgia and Circassia were being issued by the Ottoman government. By the end of the 19th century, white slaves had virtually disappeared, except in Arabia, while black slavery was not abolished in most Islamic countries until the period between the two world wars of the 20th century, and still existed in Mauritania and the Sudan at the end of the 20th century. The horrors of the Atlantic voyage in packed and suffocating slave ships, together with exposure to new diseases from Europeans and other African tribes, as well as the general dangers of the Atlantic crossing in that era, took a toll in lives amounting to about 10% of all slaves shipped to the Western Hemisphere in British vessels in the 18th century, the British being the leading slave traders of that era. However, the death toll among slaves imported by the Islamic countries, many of these slaves being forced to walk across the vast burning sands of the Sahara, was twice as high. Thousands of human skeletons were strewn along one Saharan slave route alone, mostly the skeletons of young women and girls. These skeletons tended to cluster in the vicinity of wells, suggesting the last desperate efforts to reach water. Slaves who could not keep up with the caravans, often because their feet had swollen from walking across the hot sands, were abandoned in the desert to die a lingering death from heat, thirst, and hunger. In 1849, a letter from an Ottoman official referred to 1,600 black slaves dying of thirst on their way to Libya. On another route, it was said that someone unfamiliar with the desert might almost be able to find his way just by following the trail of skeletons of people and camels. Widespread loss of life began with the initial slave raids. As late as 1886, an Austrian who was an apologist for slavery nevertheless reported, "Negro villages are burned, all the men killed, and their women and children are taken on months-long, terrible marches." The march from slave-gathering areas, like the region around Lake Chad, across the Sahara Desert to the Mediterranean Sea, took about 3 months, and often only the strongest survived. Other slave routes to Islamic countries were over water, but this meant risking interception by the British Navy, and that in turn often meant that slaves were thrown overboard to drown, rather than being allowed to remain on board to be discovered as incriminating evidence. The trans-Saharan caravan route was the most deadly, however. It has been estimated that, for every slave to reach Cairo alive, 10 died on the way. Nor was Cairo exceptional. Missionary explorer David Livingstone, among others, estimated that several slaves were captured for every one that reached the Mediterranean alive. Women were particularly vulnerable, and were more in demand than men. They brought higher prices in the Islamic countries, where they were widely used as domestic servants or as concubines. Ethiopian women sold for higher prices than Negro women, and white women from the Caucasus brought the highest prices of all. A special danger to men and boys was castration, to produce the eunuchs widely used in Islamic countries for work in the harems. Because the operation was forbidden under Islamic law, it was usually performed early, and often crudely, before reaching areas under the effective control of the Ottoman Empire. An estimated 90% of the men or boys died from the operation, though some groups of slave traders were sufficiently skilled to have much lower mortality rates. Eunuchs brought far higher prices than other slaves. Dead and dying slaves were a common sight in the wake of a slave caravan. David Livingstone said that the common incidents of the slave trade that he had seen were so nauseous that I always strive to drive them from memory. For example, one woman, who was unable to carry both her load and young child, had the child taken from her and saw its brains dashed out on a stone. It was not only the Christian missionary Livingstone who was shocked by the brutality of Arab slave raiders and traders, so was Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, who was a battle-hardened military commander. The prime destination of the African slave trade to the Islamic world was Istanbul, capital of the Ottoman Empire, where the largest and busiest slave market flourished. There, women were paraded, examined, questioned, and bid on in a public display, often witnessed by visiting foreigners, until it was finally closed down in 1847 and the slave trade in Istanbul moved underground. In other Islamic countries, however, the slave markets remained open and public, both to natives and foreigners. In 1868, a British captain witnessed the scene at a slave market in Zanzibar. Rows of girls from the age of 12 and upwards are exposed to the examination of throngs of Arab slave dealers and subjected to inexpressible indignities by the brutal dealers. This market functioned until 1873, when 2 British cruisers appeared offshore, followed by an ultimatum from Britain that the Zanzibar slave trade must cease or the island would face a full naval blockade. This was part of a wider crackdown on the seaborne slave trade in 1873, which caused the trade to become localized rather than to disappear entirely. The treatment of slaves in transit by slave traders often differed from the treatment of slaves at their destinations, but this varied according to both the geographical destinations and the occupational destinations of the slaves. A domestic slave in Istanbul might receive much milder treatment than a plantation slave in East Africa. Although slaves in the Islamic world performed a wide variety of work, pearl divers in the Persian Gulf, seamen in the Indian Ocean and Red Sea, agricultural laborers in Ethiopia or Zanzibar, domestic service was much more common in the Islamic world than in the Western Hemisphere, and plantation labor was much rarer. Wealthier men in the Ottoman Empire often had harems with hundreds of women and substantial numbers of eunuchs to work there. In the Sultan's palaces, black eunuchs worked in the women's quarters, while white eunuchs worked in his court. Both sets of eunuchs included leaders who achieved a certain prosperity and influence, or even wealth and power, but of course they perpetuated neither their race nor their culture. Eunuchs were sometimes trusted with high military or civilian posts, on grounds that they had no incentive to try to establish a rival dynasty, nor were they likely to be corrupted from their duties by the seductions of women. While the treatment of slaves by their ultimate purchasers, as distinguished from the slave traders who brought them to market, has been considered generally milder in the Islamic world than in the Western Hemisphere plantation societies, the evidence is much sketchier, for there was no organized anti-slavery movement in the Muslim countries, as there was in Britain, the United States, and elsewhere in Western civilization, to serve as a source of information on abuses of slaves. There was no market in these countries for literature, such as the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, or for the autobiographies of Frederick Douglass and other former slaves. There was in general very little writing about slavery in the Islamic world, where slavery was simply not an issue. Plantation slavery in the Western Hemisphere was not surrounded by walls, and so could be observed by outsiders, many of them critical of the institution of slavery itself and alive to its abuses. What happened behind the walls of Ottoman Empire homes and palaces is much less known. Still less can anyone know today what was in the minds and hearts of those slaves, how they felt about being a degraded people in a foreign land, how a eunuch felt about being deprived of a normal family life, how a concubine felt about being made available, without regard to her own feelings, to her owners or to whomever her owner might give, lend, or sell her. What is known is that there was an extremely low reproduction rate among the Africans enslaved in the Muslim countries. Black women who had children sired by slave owners were sometimes freed, but the magnitude and effect of this phenomenon were not such as to leave a major black population in the region. The story of the African diaspora today is thus largely the story of the descendants of Africans in the Western Hemisphere.
People today might not like to hear the word slavery, especially when they see what ISIS did to Yazidi women when they were slaves a long time ago. But don't be surprised if this was a usual thing to do in the past, even though things are very different now. Slavery is one of the oldest human practices. Not only is it one of the oldest, but it is also one of the most common. Almost every historical culture, from Sumer to Babylon to Egypt, had slaves. Even though it has been around for a long time, slavery is still a secondary problem that is rarely studied. There is also a study of slavery, which focuses a lot on farm slavery in the New World, especially in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the United States. Not much has been written about slavery in the past of Islam. In fact, Muslim historians often think of the problem as a touchy one. So, slavery has never been a part of the great history of the Islamic world. Slavery in the Middle East. In the past, most slaves were owned by kings, religious leaders, and other important people. A few slaves were owned separately. Often they were taken from war prisoners and then used to farm lands and care for royal herds. Even though divine faiths have grown in the Middle East, it is interesting that slavery still exists. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the three divine faiths, all agree that slavery exists. By the time the Prophet Muhammad started spreading Islam in the 7th century, slavery was a well-established and widely accepted part of life in Arabia. In fact, at that time, the slave trade path started in Sudan and Somalia and ended in Arabia and Egypt. So it's not surprising that Muhammad accepted slavery and saw it as an important part of the complex social system of his time. The Prophet was more of a reformer than a rebel when it came to slavery. He didn't plan to end slavery completely anytime soon. Instead, her goal was to make slaves' lives better by being kind to them. During Hajj and Dah, the Prophet showed again how he felt about slavery by telling slaves to get food and clothes while their masters got food and clothes. When masters couldn't take care of their slaves, they had to set them free. Since slavery had been around for a long time in the Middle East, it made sense at the time that there wasn't a more bold way to end it. Slaves have become an important part of the Arab economy and way of life in Arabia itself. The end of slavery had a big effect on society, and it wasn't impossible for things to get out of hand. In the end, there was no effort to end slavery, so it continued to grow during the Islamic era. Under Islamic law, there are two ways to make someone your slave. The first comes from jihad, which means holy war, and the second comes from people whose parents were slaves. So when a slave couple had a child, the kid was automatically a slave. These two ways were used to make sure that only non-Muslims were made slaves. During the spread of Islam in the 1st century, jihad became one of the most important ideas. During this time, many places were quiet, but there was also an unanswered question. Was the holy goal of jihad still the main reason for all of these advances? Or was getting loot and slaves the main reason? This question became the starting point for a lot more study, especially during the time when Islam grew after the Prophet died. The development of the slave system. Over time, these two ways of getting slaves were joined by buying and selling slaves. This didn't go against the Quran, and Muawiyah, the first ruler of the Umayyads, started it. Since then, more slaves have been sold in the Islamic world. In this buying and selling, the price of slaves is based on whether they are male or female. Castrated guys cost the most, and young white women cost the next most. Islam says that slave owners can't use female slaves for their own benefit or force them to become whores. Before Islam, slavery and prostitution were popular in the Middle East. This is a very important change. Still, Islam gave bosses a break by letting them have sexual relations with slaves. As concubines, they got to eat better and wear nicer clothes. They don't have to do housework either, so all they have to do is serve their lord. The rulers of the Islamic Empire at the time not only used these female slaves as concubines, but they also gave them as gifts. As part of the political process, slaves were sometimes given as gifts. Musa ibn Nusayr, the governor of Ifriqiya, gave slaves as gifts as a way to get along with other people. He also helped catch about 300,000 Berbers and the rest of the North African Berber tribes. Some of this huge number of slaves were put to work in the army, some were given to the kings of Egypt and Damascus as slaves, and the rest were sold. Slavery seems hard to separate from the growth of Islamic culture, since it was still an important part of people's lives when Islam reached its golden age. During this time, slaves were divided into two groups, black slaves, called ABD, and white slaves, called Mamluks and Kuls. The fact that slaves were grouped by color also meant that their jobs were different. Most black slaves were put in charge of peasants and household tasks, while Mamluk slaves and Kurds were put in charge of the army and government. Turks were famous as slaves in the military because they were good riders, could shoot arrows, and were loyal to their masters. In addition to being loyal, military slaves help rulers gain more control over an area and weaken the power of local elites who might threaten central power. When this group of slaves based on their skin color was made, they were treated differently. In reality, slaves who were white had more freedom than slaves who were black. If they did well, they could move up in society, while black people didn't have as many chances. So it's not surprising that after the Umayyads, black slaves were rarely found in strategic places around palaces. This system of grouping slaves also led to the rise of several slave kingdoms, including the Mamluks of Egypt. Slaves who had been in the army and in charge of the government ran the family. Prophet Muhammad not only taught Muslims to enslave women, he also allowed Muslims to sell their female slaves in slave markets. Sunan Ibn Majah 2517. We used to sell our slave women and the mothers of our children, or Ummahat Awaldina, when the Prophet was still living among us, and we did not see anything wrong with that. Notice this sentence: we used to sell our slave women. This information definitely contradicts the notion that Islam promotes the liberation of slaves. What these Muslims did is exactly the opposite.
Despite the millions of Africans sold into the Muslim world, there aren't many communities of their descendants living in non-African Muslim countries today. The practice persisted well into the modern era. As late as 1903, there were still 194 African eunuchs serving the Ottoman ruling family. Think about that. While your great-grandparents were alive, while the Wright brothers were making their first flight, African men were still being castrated and forced into service. This continued until the dawn of the 20th century, and its impact on African demographics, on families, on entire societies, continues to reverberate through generations. This was just one aspect of a system designed to not just enslave people, but to erase them entirely from history. But it makes you think, though, how was this justified at all? In 1842, the British Consul General in Morocco wrote to the Sultan with a simple question: would he consider taking measures to stop enslavement, or at least the trade? The Sultan's response was chilling in its clarity. He would not do anything about it. Why? Because it had been the norm since the time of the sons of Adam, and no sects of Islam were against it. He would not permit anything the Quran forbids, he wrote, and would not make unlawful anything that the Quran has allowed. This wasn't just one ruler's opinion. Religious scholars had been providing the intellectual framework for this trade for centuries. Take Ibn Khaldun, the Tunisian Arab historian from 1332 to 1406. His view? That the only peoples to accept slavery are the Negroes because of their lower degree of humanity, their place being closer to the animal stage. Or consider Ahmed Alwan Sharisi, the Algerian Arab theologian from 1430 to 1508. When asked about enslaving people from Abyssinia who had converted to Islam, his response was simple: if their conversion came after being enslaved, Islam doesn't demand their liberation. Why? Because their enslavement was caused by unbelief. But here's where it gets even more twisted. While Islamic law technically forbade enslaving fellow Muslims, in practice, if you were a black Muslim, you could still be enslaved. The ruler of Bornu discovered this the hard way when he wrote a desperate letter to the Sultan in Egypt, complaining about how traders were ravaging his territory and enslaving freemen. Even members of his own family, Muslims, all of them. The holiest site in Islam, Mecca itself, became a bustling hub for this trade. People would buy enslaved in this market when they visited for Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage. They were brought there as a commodity, easier to protect than other precious goods in a huge caravan. All the way up to 1960.
Not all slaves come from black Africa. They can also be procured on the Arabian Peninsula. Sometimes all you have to do is organize a party. The girls come out of the shelter of their homes. They arrive from nearby villages. The canny organizers of the party have accomplished their purpose. They can study the girls at their leisure. Decide which ones they will try to buy from their fathers or their husbands. Which ones they will have to kidnap. In a small villa on the outskirts of an African city on the Red Sea, he gathers the children of his prostitutes in what is officially called an orphanage. Actually, it is a training school for slaves. For the first few months, the mothers can visit their children. Then, the Greek takes over, rearing the children and training them until they are old enough to be of commercial interest to the traders of the Middle East. Prices vary according to age, color of skin, and the work the child is intended for. An attractive half-caste girl of 12 may be worth as much as $5,000.
Facts about the British Empire that you weren't taught in school. In the 19th century, the Royal Navy set up a force to wipe out the slave trade. After the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1807, the West Africa Squadron was formed. The squadron's goal was to patrol the African coast and intercept or seize any vessel that was slaving. In a campaign that was to last over 50 years, the squadron almost entirely wiped out the slave trade on the African coast. The mere threat of the mighty Royal Navy was often used to get African chiefs to abolish slavery in their realms. One commander of note was Joseph Denman. He led a highly aggressive action against the slavers, burning their factories and freeing hundreds of slaves. Zeal often caused diplomatic incidents, but he was praised by Lord Palmerston, who said taking a wasp's nest is more effective than catching the wasps one by one. In all, 150,000 slaves were freed and 1,600 ships seized. The naval and political supremacy of the British Empire was key to success. This has been described as the most costly moral action in modern history.
The masters of these fast lateen-rigged ships, which were methodically packed in sardine-like fashion with men, women, and children, maneuvered skillfully in evading the small force of British sloops.
See, they had to evade the smaller force of British sloops. The British was going on making sure slavery had ended. Okay? So they would stop the ships on the oceans. But the Arabs had these quick, smaller ships. Go ahead.
Charged with the impossible mission of interdicting this illicit traffic.
Meaning slave trade. Go ahead.
The blacks caught up in this trade were fated to be sold in the slave marts of Arabia.
Wait. It says the blacks caught up in this trade were fated to be sold in the slave marts of Arabia. So we were sold in Arabia too. Go ahead.
The Persian Gulf.
We were sold in the Persian Gulf too. Go ahead.
The Ottoman Empire.
That's Turkey. Go ahead.
And India.
So we don't talk about this. Give me the next book. Next inside the same book, next page, Read.
That these questions were raised and discussed so seriously within the context of the enslavement of blacks leads one to believe that they were the main victims of the widespread practice of enslavement of Muslims by Muslims.
Wait. Do y'all see that? The enslavement of Muslims by Muslims. Go ahead.
It clearly indicates that slavery in Islam,
listen good,
a religion largely free of racism,
like Malcolm said, it's free of racism,
struck harshly and unfairly at people with black skin.
Do you hear this? Do you hear this? What's wrong with black folks today? The scholars know what happened. Y'all keep playing games in Islam out there. Give me the next page, please.
When
I say castrate, they used to cut our rods off to make sure you did not sex their mothers, wives, or daughters. Read that.
Many young castrates served as guards, messengers, and not uncommonly as confidants to their owners.
Watch this.
Many were sent to guard the holy ground of the Kaaba in Mecca.
Read.
in the tomb of the prophet in Medina.
So as slaves, they made us watch the Kaaba stone. We had to guard the Kaaba, and we had to guard the tomb of old demon, the prophet, what he called self-proclaimed prophet. That's how they used the black slaves. Everybody understand this? Okay, give me the inside next page.
Muslim Arabs sold a lot of East Africans as slaves to the Middle East and other places through the Sahara Desert and the Indian Ocean over the course of several hundred years. Experts say it's time to talk about this in a more open way. Today, the island of Zanzibar is known as one of the best places to visit in East Africa. Its white sand beaches, clear waters, and hotels give guests from all over the world a vacation they will never forget. The dark past that hung over this sunny paradise 200 years ago has been gone for a long time. The island, which is now a semi-independent part of Tanzania, was thought to be the center of the East African slave trade at the time. In the colorful markets, you could buy things like ivory and cloves, which were very expensive. But there was one thing that stood out more than anything else. Hundreds of slaves. From Eastern Europe to North Africa, Africans have been sold as slaves since ancient times. In the 7th century, when Islam was getting stronger in North Africa, it became famous. This was 700 years before Europeans went to Africa and 1,000 years before West Africans were sold to America. Back then, Arab Muslims in North and East Africa sold Africans they had kidnapped to the Middle East. There, they worked in the fields, as teachers, or as harem guards. Because of this, it was usual for male slaves to be castrated. Islamic law, on the other hand, said that Muslims, including African Muslims, could not be made slaves. In an interview with DW, Senegalese author Tidiane Ndiaye said, "At first, Arab Muslims in Eastern and Central Europe took white slaves to sell them to Arabia. But the growing military power of Europe stopped Islamic expansion, and when there weren't enough slaves to go around, Arab Muslims turned their attention to Black Africa in a big way. Roots of slavery in Africa." Ndiaye says that slavery has been around in almost all societies. Before people moved there, this was also true in Africa. In Central East Africa, different ethnic groups like the Yao, Makua, and Marava were at war with each other, and whole groups of people on the continent traded with people they had taken in wars. Arab Muslims ran into structures that were already there, which made it easier for them to buy slaves for their own needs. Professor Emeritus of Swahili and African Linguistics at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, Abdulaziz Lodi, says that slavery was a part of many African cultures. When it came to trade, the people who were most important were the tribal Africans themselves. There were no jails in many African countries, so people who were caught were sold. Zanzibar as East Africa's slave hub. In East Africa, the slave trade really took off in the 1600s. Every year, more and more traders from Oman moved to Zanzibar. Because there was a lot of trade on the Swahili coast, the island became even more important in foreign trade, including the slave trade. This is how East Africa's biggest slave market got started. Estimates, some of which are very different from one another, are the only way to know how many Africans were sold from East to North Africa. A big reason for this is that many of the slaves died. Researchers have found that about 3 out of every 4 slaves died before they could be sold at the market. People died because they were hungry, sick, or tired from long trips. Author Ndiaye says that 17 million East Africans were sold into slavery. Most people still think of the so-called transatlantic slave trade, which was when Europeans brought slaves to the New World. But Arab Muslim slavery was actually much worse, Ndiaye said. The Trans-Saharan Road was used to bring 8 million Africans from East Africa to Morocco or Egypt. 9 million more people were sent to places near the Red Sea or the Indian Ocean. The spice of slavery. Lodi, a historian, doesn't agree with Ndiaye's number. 17 million? How is that possible when there may have been less than 40 million people living in Africa at the time? There were no such numbers back then. Old reports were also always questionable. For example, the Scottish preacher and explorer David Livingstone thought that 50,000 slaves were sold every year in the markets of Zanzibar. There aren't even close to 50,000 people living in Zanzibar now. Lodi said, "The numbers have neither hand nor foot." Egypt and Saudi Arabia did not take all slaves. Omani people moved to Zanzibar in 1820 and began growing cloves to meet the rising demand on the world market. Large estates grew quickly, and slaves were cheap to buy at the nearby slave market. American historian Frederick Cooper says that from 1839 to 1860, the amount of cloves shipped went from 565, 1,246 pounds, to 12,600 kilograms. Zanzibar went from being known as the center of the slave trade to being known as the center of having slaves. This made it famous for people like the legendary slave trader Tipu Tip. The end of slavery? In what is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, slaves rose up at the end of August 1791. The end of the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and colonialism in Africa was greatly helped by these two movements. But it wasn't until 1873 that Sultan Sayyid Bargash of Zanzibar, under pressure from Great Britain, signed a deal that made it illegal to trade slaves in his territory. Even that order was not carried out well. East Africa did not finally get rid of slavery until 1909. Author Ndiaye says that slavery still happens, but in a different way. It is thought that about 40 million people still live in slavery around the world. There are a lot of people in Africa. Mauritania says it has done away with slavery, but in fact, not much has changed in North Africa. Young people are made to work against their will and are sexually abused. Lodi says that there have been accounts of slave markets in Libya and that a case of slavery was found in Tanzania a few years ago. In a faraway place, 50 to 60 boys were made to work in a mine. They weren't paid, and they lived in a camp with armed men watching over them. Ndiaye says that the economic effects of the West's rule over Africa are worse than the effects of slavery in East Africa. The West still controls the economies of many of these countries. This is something that many smart people talk about. But Ndiaye says it's also important to talk about what happened in East Africa over the years. Most African authors haven't written a book about the Arab-Muslim slave trade yet because they want to stay true to their faith. There are 500 million Muslims in Africa, and it's better to blame the West than to talk about what Arab Muslims did in the past.
Arab Islamic slave trade of East Africans. Over at least 100 million people were enslaved. That was before the transatlantic.
Hundreds of years before. That's why you have Zanzibar, bro. You know, a lot of people that live in Zanzibar, they're the descendants of slaves.
Okay.
But they call themselves Swahili because freeborns at that time were Swahili. So Swahili became a euphemism for ex-slave.
I did not know that.
At least 700 years before the transatlantic slave trade.
Wow.
Yeah. And in that slave trade, they took majority women, African women and girls. So it wasn't just human trafficking, it was sex trafficking as well.
Wow.
And they don't talk about it. It's on the hash. If you know, you know. If you don't know, you see that that channel is still open because there's issues. They're taking so-called domestic workers.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's sex trafficking. Because I know Kenya had an issue. There was a lady who was fighting for women in Kenya. There's also issues from the Ugandan route. There's also still issues from Nigeria. And what is going on?
Some countries, I'm pretty sure, have banned domestic workers from going to Qatar and them places because people are getting their organs harvested.
Yes, there's that as well.
Yeah, people come back with no kidneys. It's crazy.
You see? So there's a lot of history for us to read. What are we doing? What are we?
Right,
We can't just be reading English Muzungu books here. We have to pick our
It's
own.
true. Because I could tell you about Henry VIII. I could tell you about his wives, everything.
Wow.
But if you told me...
know his wives.
I know his wives. Before the headed died, all of that nonsense. But if you told me now, tell me about your history. You that I'd be like, I know the king.
Yeah.
But that's about it.
Dubai's a dreamland, right? 7-star hotels, the tallest buildings, golden Lamborghinis. But just a few miles away from all that luxury, there's a world that Dubai doesn't want you to see. You've seen the skyline, the yachts, the influencers sipping $100 lattes. Dubai is sold as a future of human progress. With human progress, tell that to the tens of thousands of workers living in conditions so poor that the global slavery index ranks them amongst the worst in the world. It wasn't always this way. Before oil, Dubai was built on fishing, pearl diving, and trade. Foreign workers were a part of society, not just disposable labor. But then the oil rush came in. A handful of families took control, creating a system that prioritizes profits over people, trapping tens of thousands into a cycle of debt and abuse. It's called the kafala system, and it sounds like a visa program, doesn't it? Well, it's not. It's a modern-day contract trap where workers pay thousands just to get a job. When they arrive, their passports are taken, salary slashed, and living conditions, they're barely livable. And Dubai's leaders claim that they've reformed the system, but reports say otherwise. Enforcement is weak and abuse is still rampant. They want you to see the magnificent Burj Khalifa, not the labor camps an hour away. And here's the crazy part. Dubai's entire economy depends on foreign workers. They make up 90% of the population, yet they have no rights. And history tells us that economies built on mass exploitation usually don't last. Just look at the past empires. When labor revolts or the economy shifts, things collapse fast. Dubai is trying to diversify beyond oil, but can it diversify beyond this system?
The United Arab Emirates, or the UAE, would have you believe that this is what their country looks like. In reality, this country is a hotbed of modern-day slavery. Let me show you why. The UAE is listed as a Tier 2 country by the Trafficking in Persons Report. This is a report that is put out every single year by the United States State Department, and it looks at how countries are fighting against human trafficking. And the reason why they ended up being Tier 2 is because they are not meeting the minimum standards to address human trafficking in the country. While the UAE would have you believe that this is what their country looks like, in reality, they're working hard to hide the victimization that's taking place within their borders. Because in 2021, they only had 19 convictions for human trafficking, while at the same time having an estimated 30,000 individuals being prostituted in Dubai alone. And many of them were migrant women who were sex trafficked into the country for the purpose of sex trafficking. Also, just like the US uses a broken visa system to exploit migrant workers, the UAE is using the kafala system, which is used throughout the Middle East. And what this is a visa system that is dependent upon sponsors who are citizens of the UAE to bring individuals into the country. So if you are a migrant looking for work, you have to have a sponsor. But when you come into the country, you are tied to that person solely. So if you want to work or exit the country, you need permission from that person to do so. This makes you very exploitable. The visa system in the UAE is clearly meant to exploit workers, because while we see beautiful buildings and structures in Dubai, it's these individuals who are being enslaved to construct it, and they make up almost 90% of the UAE's population. So they are individuals who are getting visas in that kafala system, and then they are tied to an individual or a company to be able to get any sort of rights. And if their passports get taken from them, those rights go out the window. And this is a common practice in the UAE. While it might not need to be said, I'm going to say it anyways. This country has more than enough money to address this problem. As you can see, they are ranked as the 22nd most wealthiest country on the planet. So they could address this problem if they wanted to. That being said, in 2021, they spent just over $39,000 to help victims of human trafficking in the country. There's a lot more I could say about the atrocities that are being committed within the borders of the UAE, but the last thing I want to say in this video is that the government is working to cover this up. And it's evident when in 2005, the Dubai government reported only 39 deaths of all nationalities for workers just like these, who make up 9/10 of the population throughout the UAE. In reality, the Indian consulate reported that there was over 970 deaths of just Indians who were in the country. Hopefully now when you think of the UAE, it's not just thinking of it as pretty pictures like this, and you understand that it's built off the backs of millions of people who are being exploited within the borders. If you want to learn more about human trafficking, be sure to follow.
One more thing, our people, the Africans, are being treated all around Middle East like a slave. You see, people go from Ethiopia, Nigeria, you know what I mean, from all African countries to these Arab nations to work, but they are being treated like a slave, my brother. So we need to talk about that, because the slavery still exists. 100%. Slavery, it just changed the name. It just changed the modern ways. It become modern slavery. People are still being enslaved by these Arab nations, these rich, oil-rich Arab nations. Yeah. But the issue the issue of Libya, though, we can't just mention Libya and blame the Arab without talking about NATO and the Western involvement of this destroying this country.
أنا أدين وأقدم باسم العرب الاعتذار والتأسف الشديد للسلوك الذي سلكه العرب وخاصة الأغنياء منهم اتجاه أخوانهم الأفارقة. لقد مارسوا أغنياء العرب في الماضي ممارسة مخجلة اتجاه أخوانهم الأفارقة، حيث شروا الأطفال وجلبوهم إلى شمال أفريقيا وإلى الجزيرة العربية وبقية المناطق العربية التي تقع بين هذين الإقليمين، واستعبدوهم وباعوهم واشتروهم وباعوهم ومارسوا الرق ومارسوا تجارة البشر بشكل مشين. الحقيقة نحن نخجل أمام أخواننا الأفارقة عندما نتذكر هذا، يعني نخجل للذين مارسوا هذه الممارسة وخاصة أغنياء العرب الذين نظروا لإخوانهم الأفارقة نظرة العبودية والدونية، وهذا لا يختلف عما عمله الغرب من أمريكا إلى أوروبا اتجاه الأفارقة، عندما عاملوهم في البداية كحيوانات واصطادوهم اصطياد، ثم عاملوهم كعبيد، ثم عاملوهم كمستعمرين، استعمروهم واستغلوهم حتى هذا اليوم. فأنا أقدم الحقيقة الاعتذار والأسف لتلك الممارسات
Are you speaking of the Arab slave trade?
Yes, sir. Yes,
okay,
sir.
okay. Without question. Now, the difference between the Arab slave trade and the European slave trade is the Arab slave trade never ended. The Arab slave trade is going on right now. And I would personally fault many African-American Sunni Orthodox Muslim leaders for hiding the Arab slave trade under the umbrella of their religion. One of the reasons I left the masjid, because I was raised Muslim, Sunni Orthodox Islam. One of the reasons I had to abdicate from the masjid is there was too much cultural imitation going on. I'm not an Arab, and black people didn't leave the white man's Christianity to go to the Arab's Islam. Now, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was a blue, black, purple man, just like Jesus, son of Joseph and Mary. You understand? So we don't have to imitate Arabs. But when you don't know who you are, you automatically pick up somebody else's culture. And every religion was incubated in a culture. So Islam was incubated in Arab culture. Although the Arabs of that day were black men who evolved into pale and yellow, still we sucked up the culture more than the religion. And there's a hadith from the Prophet Muhammad who said, give them religion, don't take away their culture. Because he understood that my 23 years of being a prophet cannot compare to 200,000+ years of African culture.
Oh, yeah.
Muhammad was only with you 23 years. Jesus was with you 3. So I'm going to throw out hundreds of thousands of years of African culture for 3 years of Jesus and 23 years of Muhammad. I got to be insane. And my problem with the Muslim brothers and sisters who I love, I'll still go to the masjid and pray. I love them, but I cannot tolerate the Arab cultural imitation. Okay? There's no such thing as Muslim food. Show me Muslim food in the Quran. The Quran does not mention anything about no Muslim food. That's Arab food. See? And you're taking Arab culture and you're putting it in your religion and you're making it divine. And that's why I agree with Dr. Yusuf bin Yaqin, Garveyite scholar, ancestor now, grandmaster teacher, when he said, religion is the deification of culture. Religion is the deification of culture. When Leonardo da Vinci painted The Last Supper in 1482, 10 years before Columbus, that white Jesus still with us now, still in the black church now, that white Jesus, that pale skin, blue-eyed, blonde hair, deified white people in the minds of Africans. It has deified us so much that most black churches will never get rid of that white Jesus, even though they know Jesus wasn't white. I spoke in Fort Lauderdale a couple years ago. There was a fundraiser for the Marcus Garvey Technical School in Kingston, Jamaica. I believe it's in Kingston. But the Marcus Garvey Technical School of Jamaica had a fundraiser and I keynoted, right? I met a brother there from Jamaica. He said, Dr. Umar, let me tell you a story. True story. He said, I belong to a church in Jamaica that has a white Jesus. He said, I went out and got a black artist to paint the most beautiful black Christ you can ever see in your life. I told the pastor, we got a black Jesus now. You can get rid of that. And the black pastor in Jamaica told him that painting will never be hung in here. This is the Jesus that we will serve. When your enemy becomes your deity, when your deity and your enemy are one in the same and you are comfortable with that, you deserve to be a slave. Yeah. You deserve to be a slave. I will never worship God in the image of another people. And the irony of it is every religious teacher in ancient time came in our skin. Buddha looked like me. Krishna looked like me. Moses, Muhammad, Jesus, they was all black, but we are so comfortable and content worshiping him in the image of our oppressor. And if you say Jesus should be black.
Christianity and Islam by nature, they are bullies of African culture. It is expressed in their intolerance of other people who believe differently from who they are. So here's a simple example. If a Muslim walks into this village, the first object is to build a mosque and make everyone in that village a Muslim. It changes your timetable of waking up. You wake up at 5, changes your fashion, changes the way you bury your loved ones. Now you must do everything according to Islamic law. The same thing is true with Christianity. Christianity walks into a space, facing the one to do. As a Zulu, as a Xhosa, you take off your shirt and put on your beautiful beads. Hebrew beads, by the way, which are Jewish. You put on your Hebrew gear, which is traditional, and you walk up to church. Christianity will look at you, though now there's a bit of tolerance. But the first glance is unacceptable. Because the God that Christianity has does not have tolerance for culture. Does not. Rather, I'd rather take off that thing, put on your shirt, put a tie on you, put a jacket, polish your shoes, and say, now you look nice. Because apparently you must become European first before you can become Christian. In order for God to accept you, he cannot accept you in your authenticity. He needs first to take you through the culture of the dominant culture, which is the colonial culture, before you can actually become an acceptable Christian. An intelligent conversation needs to take place where we say, is everything that we are doing in the Christian church Christian? Or some of the things, norms, and rituals that we are performing are actually European culture, but now they have been couched and packaged as Christianity. The way we sing, for example, the way we dress, for example, the way we eat, for example, the way we celebrate our things, our holidays, our festivals, our Passovers, and etc. Are these things, Easters, are these things biblical? Christmases.
You ruffled a lot of feathers with
some changes that are cutting
Easter
trees.
issue.
First Arab invasion into Egypt. Now, it's interesting because once that invasion comes, they help the African in Egypt drive the Romans out of power.
Right.
But the Romans don't leave.
And then they
just stay
there.
They no longer have power. Ali then engages with the African soldiers and they assassinate Othman, who he feels is the wrongful leader. But he would be assassinated by Othman's nephew, Muawiyah, who's general. Now, let me tell you, the only reason I brought all of that out there, because this then precipitates this major invasion of North Africa, which has not stopped until this day. And the Arabs who initially invaded lost the Muslim system in the 8th century to the Turks and the European whites. And from the 8th century to now, Islam have not been in the hands of Arab leadership.
You said they lost the system.
The Islamic system was lost to the Turkish mercenaries. They had fighting their wars for them. And the Turks, under the Mamluks, the Seljuks, and then the Ottoman, controlled Islam, ravished Africa, ran the African slave trade, was in partnership with the European merchant class that invaded West Africa, Central Africa, and East Africa, providing the slaves to the Europeans. But there's a methodology, and it needs to be understood. You cannot take away the Arabs' involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. They were paramount.
And they were the
because
first
they had
big
an army
slave
and they
traders.
had guns.
Yeah.
You cannot take away the Arabized African Muslims' involvement in the slave trade. Now listen to what I said, the Arabized or Turkicized African Muslim involved in that trade. But there was a method they would use. They would come into a village. Most of Africa were basically agrarian or fishers.
That's right.
They would come into a village with their army and say, we'll be back in 30 days. We want 50 men and 20 women. Now, either you provide us with that, or we will take who we want, including you and your family.
And the Africans did not have guns. They did not have those things.
So now you had a village either have to fight, and in most cases, many of them did, and was wiped out totally, and some were victorious.
Some fled.
And some fled to other parts of Africa, or you had to find 50 people from someplace. Many times you got volunteers from the village who volunteered to go instead of having the community destroyed.
Yeah.
There, if you go to Paga and to northern Ghana and Burkina Faso, you will see village after village and town after towns where we built our houses without windows, with the doors in the top of the house, with just slits for our arrows to fight off the slave traders, and courtyards with doors that no more than 3 feet tall. So you had to get down to come in, and that way we could stop you.
Even today, some of those. So how you have to go way up and down to get in there.
You can go and visit these places all over that area of Africa where enslaved ancestors came from, or you can go to Gambier. It is a community in Benin.
Now, the Muslim Arab slave trade began in the 8th century. The Muslim Arab slave trade predates the invention of race. Race is a European invention that was created, it was invented during the period of Enlightenment. Now, the type of slavery that was going on in South America, the Caribbean, and North America was chattel slavery. This was race-based slavery. This was different from the Muslim Arab slave trade. And this is why it's so important to know the difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality. Now, you also mentioned the contributions of Africa as that of just being slavery and subjugation. Well, that's simply not true. And this is why it's so important to view world history, African history, from a decolonized mindset. Because let me say this, and let me ask this. Who all taught the great Greek philosophers like Pythagoras, Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates? Who all taught them what they know? Where did the ideas originate from? Africa. And if it had not been for Africa, the world as we know it would not be so. I would encourage you all to look into universities like Timbuktu, where people from around the world came to learn and be educated. The contributions of Africa go way beyond slavery and subjugation. Now, for those who want to learn more and increase your knowledge and understanding concerning the devastating effects of European colonization and imperialism on Africa, I would highly recommend this book by Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Now, normally I don't do this, but here are the table of contents. Please pause to read.